My name is John Rossant. I'm the chairman of the NewCities Foundation, and I'm absolutely delighted to be chatting today with Arvind Satyam, who is one of the key players in Cisco's city-focused activities. Now, Arvind, one of the areas that we've long looked at and focused on at the NewCities Foundation is infrastructure finance, and looking at a lot of the new kinds of tools that are increasingly available to finance needed urban infrastructure. And of course, infrastructure is an important word nowadays. We have to have more of it, and we have to have improved infrastructure. We put together a research program a few years ago that Cisco took part in, called Innovations in Financing Urban Infrastructure. And now, lo and behold, in November in Barcelona, you guys announced this amazingly innovative facility for cities around the world, financing facility. And I read about it and I was absolutely astounded because this is really something new under the sun. And we're very eager to know more, what your plans are for this and what your plans are for rolling it out.
Great. So first of all, it's great to be here with you, John. So if you think about the innovative, the research project that we went through, it identified a couple of things. The first one is there's a huge shortfall in terms of private financing that's actually getting allocated towards smart city projects. And it's not a case of lack of appetite. It's not a case of lack of demand, right? Both from cities in terms of their ability to absorb it, or from private investors.
Right.
Because what we learned is when we look at traditional infrastructure, whether that be toll roads or bridges, traditional infrastructure has been financed a lot through private investment, through pension funds, through infrastructure funds, through sovereign wealth funds. And that money's sitting there, and they're trying to figure out, how do I deploy this capital towards smart projects? And so over the course of the last 18 months, we've actually been working with some of these investors. And we approached cities, and they said, we'd love to use private investment in addition to what we have, because mayors want to move faster, right? Cities do not want to be in a position where they're scaling these projects as small-scale deployments. We're absolutely living in an era of scale. So with that in mind, we said, how do we actually make it easier for cities to work on larger scale projects? How do we bring these private financiers to the table? And how do we make this repeatable? So that's the backdrop. So we announced this $1 billion facility. Now, first of all, why do we go with such a large number? And I think the billion by no means is not the limitation here, right? But it's a combination of what Cisco's providing through Cisco Capital, which is our in-house leasing arm. And then we have 3 additional partners. We have Whitehelm Capital, which is a pension fund that pulls money and they invest in infrastructure projects. So they've historically invested in wind turbines and in airports and other projects. We have APG Capital, which is similar, out of Europe, out of Netherlands. And then lastly, we have Digital Alpha, which is an infrastructure fund that's been investing in technology-based infrastructure assets. So they look at cloud-based models,
right,
and they're really interested in investing in smart city projects. So that's the group. And so we've also looked at a number of models, and that's the reason why we announced this.
That's really fascinating, but a couple of questions. One is, how do you begin to evaluate risk on kind of smart infrastructure projects which haven't really been tried out before? Yeah. That's one question. And I think another question is, give me an example of concrete example of cities where you're actually beginning to finance some projects.
Right. So the idea of risk, I mean, if you look at bank loans, these are financial instruments that have been around for a long time. So if you and I were to go to a bank and approach them for a home loan, we have an idea of what that criteria is, right? And then the bank at the same time understands what a product is, because they understand, here's the location, here's the home, et cetera. And your point is valid, which is, how do you do this in an industry where these products are being created? In other words, you have smart infrastructure that is being deployed today at scale. And then how do you figure out which projects are good projects? And how do you figure out what is the type of financial engineering that you need to make this work. And I think this is where what we're doing is to work on some of the larger projects with these companies. And the reason we launched that with these companies is we've actually experimented with them and looking at the appetite of projects that they would look at. So let me take you through some examples. So one example would be investing. So you see a lot of cities come out with concessions where they're saying, I want to do a smart lighting project. And I would like a consortium to be created where you would come in and, one, build out the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure. These are things that Cisco would not historically finance. Then secondly, this physical infrastructure requires a technology infrastructure that sits behind it, whether that be a Wi-Fi network, a mesh network. You have the secure infrastructure that makes sure that the entire solution's secure. Then you have the data and the applications that sit on top, right? To pull all of this solution together. So the key for us is how do we go in and bring financiers to come in and finance that overall solution? And what financiers were telling us is, one, they want to make sure that these projects are large. So they would not be looking at financing a project where it's a square mile in a city. But the ideal sweet spot would be projects that could be 10 million to 50 million. And in fact, the limitation is not the northbound. It's really the projects that you want to get started with. The next thing that they look at is, what is my ROI? Typically, these are 10 to 15-year concessions. If you take lighting, the ROI comes from energy savings. So to move towards a smart lighting environment, from the transition from halogen to LED can get to you a 60% saving. Right. But to go from there to a smart lighting environment where you're able to modulate the amount of light based on ambient light and other characteristics, you can actually make that north of 70%. A second example would be parking, where we've spoken about parking for a number of years. It's the number 2 revenue generator, and cities clearly see an uptick, and financiers clearly see that. So no different to toll roads and others. Parking is another example where they're very excited about it. We're seeing models around waste management. So one, it's the size of the project. Two, it's the solutions that are included that actually have a clear ROI, either saving money or making money. And the third thing that I would say, which is very important, is an environment in a city that allows you to do this at scale. So you get in the ground and you're able to go execute this. You either have a project vehicle or you have an operating company that comes in. And these are the ones that we're really interested in accelerating and financing.
Well, Arvind, when I read about this back in November, at first I thought, wow, this is a great solution. This is geared for smaller cities, for medium-sized cities, for tier 2 cities around the world, where city leaders may not have the kind of financial literacy or sophistication that they would have, let's say, in a New York or a Hong Kong or London. But perhaps I'm wrong. I mean, perhaps this is a facility that any city, big or small, can use in an intelligent way.
So it's a good question, and we get asked this from the community. I would say it's less about the city, it's more about the opportunity. Right. So you can have a lighting project for a part of New York City which might fit the criteria. But at the same time, you could have cities like Albuquerque, you could have cities like Kansas City, where you might be doing many things, where you have lighting and parking and security and waste management that are all tied together. So it's not a case of tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 cities. It applies. It would have to be a minimum size of a project for it to be worthwhile. And then secondly, the key is to make sure that the opportunity is something that you can work on and you can scale quickly.
Well, give me an example, of somewhere where you're actually using
this
facility.
So I'm going to give you 2 examples. We've spoken about investing in infrastructure, but there's some other models that we're seeing where we're seeing new solution providers that are being created. So we look at urban operators, we look at technology companies, and technology companies provide the solution, the technology solution, and then you have operators that are managing city contracts. You're actually having companies that are fusing both of these. So you have new forms of urban solution providers. So we invested in a company in the UK called Connexon, and they're starting off in the city of Hull. And what they're doing is they're taking our Cisco Kinetic for Cities platform, they're building out the networks, and then they're approaching the city and they would go to the mayor and the city managers and say, I'm actually going to provide all of this to you as a service. And that's a great model, right? Because now what you're doing is you're actually moving it from a upfront investment, which is CapEx, to a monthly subscription, which is much easier for cities to absorb. They don't have to deal with the technology complexity. They don't have to deal with the security, all of those elements. You essentially have this company that's going to provide the contracts, and they're also committed to innovating going forward. So that's a
And will this company invoice in Ethereum?
That's a great question, I think. Now the question is Ethereum or Bitcoin
Yeah.
or IOTA.
Yeah.
I think that could be the future.
Yeah.
Now, just kidding aside, we also look at concepts like City Coin, right? Where you have the ability for citizens or you have the ability for developers to develop solutions that can then, based on use, actually go up in value.
Yeah.
Right? So these are new concepts that we
Yeah.
can bring back in.
We've looked at that very closely too. It's fascinating stuff.
And I think when we have this conversation in the future, I think that's an area where I know both of us want to look at and see where things go. Another example I'm going to talk about, John, is focused on really looking at specific projects where we're trying to finance large infrastructure, overall infrastructure deals. And some of these are a little bit early, but I just want to leave the audience with the view that here it's not a case of just financing routers and platform and those elements. The financiers are really committed to financing the entire solution.
Arvind, how does the overall regulatory framework have to change or evolve to make initiatives like this really pay off in the long run? I mean, I'm thinking about the regulatory framework around concessions in a city, for example.
So it's a great point. So if you look at concessions today, a lot of these were designed in a world where physical infrastructure really didn't change for a long time. So you take lighting, it was about a light pole, you had a light bulb, you had fixtures, and then the problem was how decorative did you want that fixture to be? But then we're living in a world today where you have smart nodes, where you have software and intelligence that's being built, and the innovation's happening on a monthly, 6-monthly, yearly basis. So do we need to have a system where you're building a fixed solution that goes into the ground for 15 to 25 years when the solution components are being innovated and being changed? So I'm glad you brought this up. One of the things that cities need to look at is the concept of smart concessions. It's going to help in terms of the solution, but also it's important for financiers because these new components actually help the ROI because they reduce the cost, they allow you to have new data streams, and it also means that the solution is not fixed in a solution that is outdated. You can constantly innovate. So We've been working with some lawyers on the whole concept of smart concessions. I know it's something that cities are interested in because they want to make sure that they get the latest and greatest. And at the same time, we believe it's something that's in the interests of technology providers and operators, but also financiers, because it's good for business.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating, Arvind. It's clear that we're in a brave new world for city administrators, for cities, for companies everywhere. I hope the audience found that interesting as I did. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. And so, John, we're really excited about helping get a lot of this smart infrastructure in cities. I think we're no longer seeing a world where people need to understand what is smart cities. I think everyone's really biased towards action. And by really helping address some of these financial impediments, we believe that we can move towards larger projects and many more of them quickly. So thank you.
Thank you.